September 1944. The autumn rain hammered down on the muddy roads of eastern France as American armoured columns pushed deeper into German-held territory. At the head of one such column, a peculiar Sherman tank rolled forward, its silhouette noticeably different from the standard M4s following behind. The front hull sat thicker, more imposing. The turret rose higher, its armour plates welded at unusual angles. To German observers watching from defensive positions, it looked like someone had taken a normal Sherman and added another tank's worth of steel to its frame. They had no idea they were looking at a solution to a problem that had plagued American armour since D-Day. This was the M4 3E2 Sherman Jumbo, and it was about to change the mathematics of survival on the Western Front. For the German tank crews and anti-tank gun operators who had grown accustomed to knocking out Shermans with relative ease, this new American tank would prove to be a shock. Their standard 75mm guns, which had reliably penetrated regular Sherman armour at combat ranges, would bounce off this monster like pebbles off a fortress wall. The Sherman Jumbo wasn't born from careful long-term planning or peacetime design committees. It emerged from desperation, rushed into production in early 1944 when American commanders realised they needed something that could take a punch and keep moving. The story of how 254 tanks came to redefine American armoured doctrine begins not with engineers or generals but with the bloody hedgerows of Normandy. The problem facing American armour in mid-1944 was simple but deadly. German defenders, dug into the ancient hedgerows and stone buildings of northern France, had perfected the art of the ambush. They would wait until American tank columns entered kill zones, then opened fire with everything they had. The Panzerfaust, a cheap disposable anti-tank weapon, could penetrate standard Sherman armour at close range. The Pak-40 anti-tank gun, firing a 75mm shell, could kill a Sherman from over 1,000 yards. And if German tanks showed up, particularly Panthers or Tigers, American tankers faced an enemy they simply couldn't penetrate from the front. The standard M4 Sherman, workhorse of the American armoured force, carried frontal armour between 51 and 76mm thick depending on the variant. The turret front measured 76mm. These numbers translated to roughly 2 to 3 inches of steel. Against German high-velocity guns, this protection proved inadequate. Crews began welding spare track links to their hulls, piling sandbags on the glacis plate, anything to add a few more inches of protection. General George Patton, never one to mince words, watched his tanks burn and demanded better. But the heavy tank the army wanted, the M26 Pershing, wouldn't arrive in meaningful numbers until 1945. Something had to be done immediately. In February 1944, as planning for the Normandy invasion reached its final stages, the Army Ground Forces submitted an urgent request. They needed an assault tank, something that could lead infantry attacks against fortified positions, something that could absorb punishment that would destroy a regular Sherman. The request specified modifications to existing tank designs to create an armoured breakthrough vehicle. 2 candidates existed. The T-14 assault tank, a purpose-built heavy design, had reached the prototype stage but performed poorly and wouldn't be ready in time. The T-26, which would eventually become the Pershing, remained months away from production. That left only one option: modify the M4A3 Sherman, the variant powered by the reliable Ford GAA V8 engine producing 500 horsepower. Engineers at the Fisher Body Tank Arsenal, a General Motors facility in Grand Blanc, Michigan, went to work. Their brief was straightforward but challenging. Take a standard M4A3 hull and turret, add enough armour to make it immune to German 75mm guns at typical combat ranges, keep it mobile enough to lead an attack, and do it fast enough to get tanks to Europe before the invasion. The solution they devised was brilliantly simple. They took the existing M4A3 hull and welded additional armour plates directly onto it. A 38mm steel plate, 1.5 inches thick, was welded onto the front glacis, bringing the total thickness to 102mm, just over 4 inches. The hull sides received the same treatment, increasing protection from 38 to 76mm, but those numbers told only part of the story. The glacis plate of the Jumbo sat at a 47-degree angle from vertical. When calculating the effective thickness against incoming shells, that angle dramatically increased the armour's capability. A shell hitting the sloped glacis didn't just have to penetrate 4 inches of steel, It had to penetrate the equivalent of nearly 6 inches due to the angle. This gave the Jumbo frontal protection that exceeded the Tiger I, the most feared tank in the German arsenal. But the most dramatic change came with the turret. Instead of adapting the standard Sherman turret, engineers created something entirely new. Based on the T-23 experimental tank's turret design, the Jumbo's turret featured 152mm of armour all around, 6 solid inches of cast homogeneous steel. The gun mantlet, the armoured housing that protected the main gun, measured an incredible 178mm at its thickest point, 7 inches of steel. This created what German gunners would later describe as an impenetrable shield. The new differential housing at the front of the hull, which protected the transmission and final drive, featured armour varying from 4 to 5.5 inches thick. Every vulnerable point on the standard Sherman had been identified and reinforced. The result weighed 42 tons, nearly a third more than a standard Sherman's 33-ton combat weight. This additional mass created engineering challenges that had to be solved quickly. The existing vertical volute spring suspension system, adequate for a 33-ton tank, now struggled under the Jumbo's weight. Ground pressure, the amount of weight concentrated on each square inch of track, threatened to bog the tank down in soft terrain. The solution came from an innovative track modification. Engineers added extended end connectors to the tracks, metal extensions welded onto the track shoes that increased the track's width. These connectors, nicknamed duckbills by the troops, spread the weight over a larger surface area. Ground pressure dropped to 14.2 pounds per square inch, manageable even with the additional armour. The final drive ratio was also modified, increasing from 2.84 to 1 to 3.36 to 1. This gear change reduced top speed, but gave the transmission and drivetrain enough mechanical advantage to move the heavy tank without burning out. Maximum speed dropped from 30 miles per hour for a standard Sherman to 22 miles per hour for the Jumbo. In practice, this speed reduction mattered less than it appeared. American armour rarely operated at maximum speed in combat. The real fighting happened at 10 to 15 miles per hour, speeds at which the Jumbo matched its lighter cousins. The trade-off was simple: 5 to 8 miles per hour of top speed in exchange for armour that could stop anything the Germans typically threw at it. The armament decision proved controversial. The army wanted to equip assault tanks with the new high-velocity 76mm M1 gun, which offered superior armour penetration compared to the older 75mm M3. But the 75 Lassaden had one critical advantage for an assault tank mission. Its high explosive shell carried 1.47 pounds of TNT compared to only 0.86 pounds in the 76mm shell. When attacking fortified positions, bunkers and infantry strongpoints, that explosive power mattered more than armour penetration. The decision was made. The Jumbo would carry the 75mm M3 gun in the new T110 gun mount, a modified version of the M62 mount designed for the 76mm gun. The mount featured a massive 178mm thick gun shield, making the entire assembly nearly impregnable from the front. This turned out to be prescient. Later in the war, when Jumbos needed better anti-tank capability, the mount design allowed field units to swap the 75mm for a 76mm gun without major modifications. The production order was approved in March 1944. Fisher Body Tank Arsenal would build 254 M4A3E2 assault tanks as quickly as possible. Production began in May 1944 and concluded in July of the same year. The speed of this program was remarkable. In just 5 months from initial approval to final delivery, the United States had designed, tested, manufactured, and shipped a completely new tank variant. This spoke to American industrial capacity in ways that terrified German planners. Each Jumbo cost roughly $64,000 to produce, about 15% more than a standard M4A3. The additional armour alone accounted for most of this cost increase, but the real expense lay in the specialised castings required for the turret and differential housing. These components required foundries capable of pouring large, complex steel castings with precise metallurgical properties. Only a handful of American foundries possessed this capability. The turrets were cast at one location, then shipped to Grand Blanc for final assembly and finishing. The first production tanks rolled off the assembly line in late May 1944. By June, As Allied forces fought their way inland from the Normandy beaches, jumbos were being loaded onto transport ships for the voyage to Europe. The Army's plan called for distributing jumbos throughout the armoured divisions, providing each division with a corps of heavily armoured assault tanks that could spearhead attacks and lead columns through dangerous terrain. The first 128 jumbos arrived in France on September 22, 1944. They were immediately distributed to units in combat, with no time for extended training or familiarization. Tank crews accustomed to standard Shermans suddenly found themselves commanding tanks that weighed 9 tons more, moved slightly slower, but offered protection they had only dreamed about. The German reaction to encountering jumbos ranged from confusion to alarm. German intelligence had catalogued the various Sherman variants, from the M4 and M4A1 with their 75mm guns, to the newer M4A1, 76 models with high-velocity weapons. But the jumbo looked different enough to cause identification problems. Some German reports initially classified them as new heavy tanks. Others thought they were field modifications. What they quickly realized was that their standard anti-tank weapons weren't working. The backbone of German anti-tank defense in late 1944 was the 75mm Pak-40, a towed anti-tank gun that had proven highly effective against standard Shermans. Firing the Panzer Granit 39 armour-piercing shell, the Pak-40 could penetrate 106mm of vertical armour at 500 yards. Against a standard Sherman's 51mm frontal armour, this meant certain penetration at ranges exceeding 1/500 yards. Against the jumbo, the mathematics changed dramatically. The jumbo's frontal glacis presented 102mm of armour at a 47-degree angle. This translated to an effective thickness of nearly 150mm. The Pak-40's standard ammunition simply couldn't penetrate at any combat range. Shots that should have killed a Sherman bounced off the jumbo's glacis, leaving nothing but scorch marks and shallow dents. The 75mm Cog 40 gun mounted on the Panzer IV, Germany's most numerous tank in 1944, faced the same problem. The Cog 40 fired essentially the same ammunition as the Pak-40, with slightly lower muzzle velocities due to the shorter cartridge case. At typical tank versus tank combat ranges of 500 to 800 yards, the Panzer IV's gun could not penetrate a jumbo from the front. Even the turret, presenting a flat 152mm face, proved immune to the 75mm gun. German tankers accustomed to engaging Shermans at range and penetrating with the first shot suddenly found themselves in extended duels, firing repeatedly while American tankers closed the distance. The only reliable way for a Panzer IV to kill a jumbo was to get a side shot at the hull or turret, where armour thickness dropped to 76mm, or to get close enough to use the tank's weak points, the lower hull, the rear armour, or the engine deck. This forced German tankers to abandon their preferred tactic of standoff engagement and get dangerously close. But getting close to a Sherman, even one with a 75mm gun, was hazardous. The jumbo carried 104 rounds of 75mm ammunition. Its rate of fire, aided by an excellent gun stabilizer system, allowed trained crews to fire 6 to 8 aimed shots per minute. The high explosive shells might not penetrate a Panzer IV's frontal armour, but they could damage optics, injure crew members through spalling, and generally make the German crew's life miserable. The German 80mm guns presented a different challenge. The famous 88, whether the KK-36 mounted on the Tiger I or the Pak-43 towed anti-tank gun, could penetrate the jumbo's frontal armour at combat ranges. But the 88 was far less common than the 75mm Glaswand's weapons. By late 1944, Tigers were relatively rare on the Western Front, with most having been destroyed or withdrawn for refitting. The Tiger II, with its even more powerful 86mm 43 gun, existed in tiny numbers. Most German defensive positions relied on the ubiquitous 75mm Pak-40 and Panzer Vs. Against these weapons, the jumbo was effectively immune from the front. This immunity translated directly into tactical advantages that American commanders quickly learned to exploit. The jumbo's primary role, leading armoured columns, played to its strengths perfectly. American armoured doctrine in 1944 emphasized rapid movement in column formation. Tanks would advance along roads in long columns, moving quickly to exploit breakthroughs or reach objectives. The danger came at choke points, bridges, crossroads, narrow village streets. German defenders would establish anti-tank guns covering these choke points, waiting for the lead tank to enter the kill zone before opening fire. Under the old doctrine, the lead tank would be a standard Sherman, likely to be destroyed or disabled by the first shot. The column would then accordion to a halt, providing a perfect target for German artillery and follow-up shots. Confusion would reign as subsequent tanks tried to bypass the knocked-out leader while under fire. With a jumbo leading the column, the equation changed. The German anti-tank gun would fire at the jumbo as it entered the kill zone. The shell would bounce off the frontal armour. The jumbo's crew, protected behind 6 inches of turret armour, could take their time identifying the threat and returning fire. If necessary, the jumbo could simply charge the anti-tank gun position, using its weight and armour to overrun the position. The rest of the column, following behind the jumbo, would then push through before German forces could reposition. This tactic, using the jumbo as a mobile shield, saved countless American lives. Tank crews knew the jumbo could take hits that would kill them. They watched as jumbos absorbed multiple direct hits, shrugged them off, and kept fighting. Morale soared. The psychological effect on German defenders proved equally significant. Gun crews who had grown accustomed to killing Shermans with well-aimed shots suddenly watched their rounds bounce off. They would fire again, see another ricochet, and fire a third time. By then, American infantry would be flanking the position, or the jumbo would be close enough to bring its 75mm gun to bear. The realization that their primary anti-tank weapon couldn't penetrate the new American tank spread quickly through German units. After-action reports from late 1944 show increasing German anxiety about the new heavily armoured Shermans. One particularly telling account comes from a German Pack 40 crew commander interviewed after his capture in October 1944. He described engaging what he thought was a standard Sherman at 600 metres range. His first shot, aimed at the glacis plate, bounced off. He ordered a second shot, this time at the turret. It also bounced. A third shot, attempting to hit the lower hull, missed as the tank turned. Before his crew could fire a fourth shot, American infantry assaulted their position. The entire engagement lasted less than 2 minutes, but it shattered the crew's confidence in their weapon. They had fired 3 shots at a Sherman, something that should have guaranteed a kill, and accomplished nothing except revealing their position. The 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armoured Division received several jumbos in September 1944. Among them was a tank that would become the most famous jumbo of the war. Its crew nicknamed it Cobra King, following the tradition of naming tanks after their company letter. As a C Company tank, it got a name starting with C. In November 1944, Cobra King was knocked out during fighting in France. The damage wasn't severe, and the tank was repaired and returned to action in Luxembourg by December. On December 23, 1944, the tank commander, Lieutenant Charles Trover, was killed by a German sniper while standing in the turret. He was replaced by First Lieutenant Charles Bogges, who would command Cobra King during the most famous action of its career. The German Ardennes offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, exploded across the quiet American sector on December 16, 1944. 3 German armies, spearheaded by elite Panzer divisions, crashed through thinly held American lines, creating a massive bulge in the Allied front. The town of Bastogne, a critical road junction in Belgium, became surrounded by December 20. The 101st Airborne Division, rushed to the town as emergency reinforcements, found itself cut off and besieged by elements of the German 5th Panzer Army. General George Patton, commanding the 3rd Army to the south, received orders to break off his offensive into Germany, wheel his entire army 90 degrees north, and attack into the southern flank of the German penetration. Patton promised to have 3 divisions attacking within 72 hours, a logistical feat considered impossible by many observers. He delivered. By December 27, 3 divisions of Patton's 3rd Army were pushing north toward Bastogne. Leading the relief effort was the 4th Armoured Division, veteran of the drive across France, and one of the most experienced armoured formations in the US Army. The 4th Armoured Division's commander, Major General Hugh Gaffey, organised his force into 3 combat commands, flexible combined arms task forces that could operate independently. Combat Command Reserve, under Lieutenant Colonel Crichton Abrams, would make the main effort toward Bastogne from the south. By December 26th, elements of the 37th Tank Battalion had fought their way to within a few miles of Bastogne. They had been in continuous combat for days, battling through German defensive positions in freezing weather and deep snow. The battalion was down to about 20 operational tanks, less than half its authorised strength, but they were close. Abrams, the battalion commander, knew that Bastogne needed relief immediately. Supply aircraft were being shot down trying to airdrop supplies. The 101st Airborne was running out of ammunition, food and medical supplies. Every hour of delay meant more American casualties. The village of Assenois sat astride the most direct route from the 37th Tank Battalion's position to Bastogne. German forces held the village in strength, with anti-tank guns, infantry and supporting armour. Taking Assenois would be costly. But bypassing it would take time the surrounded troops didn't have. Abrams decided on a direct assault. At 3:00 p.m. on December 26th, 13 artillery battalions opened fire on Assenois, plastering the village with high explosive shells. The barrage lifted at 4:15 p.m. Abrams, pointing at a map, gave his orders to Lieutenant Boggess. Get to those men in Bastogne. No elaborate plan, no detailed coordination, just go. Boggess climbed into Cobra King's turret and gave the order to move out. Behind him followed 2 more Shermans, a half-track filled with armoured infantry, and 2 additional tanks. The small column accelerated toward Assenois, Cobra King in the lead, its 42 tons of armour and firepower pointing straight at the German defences. The attack caught the German defenders still reeling from the artillery barrage. Cobra King crashed through Assenois at speed, its crew firing at every target they saw. The gunner, Corporal Milton Dickerman, worked the 75mm gun like a machine gun, firing 21 rounds in a few minutes at German positions, vehicles and troop concentrations. The Jumbo's armour shrugged off return fire. German troops, expecting to see American tanks after the barrage, had positioned anti-tank weapons covering the approaches. But their Pak-40s couldn't penetrate Cobra King's frontal armour. Shots bounced off as the tank roared through the village. The 2 standard Shermans following behind took advantage of the chaos Cobra King created, firing at targets the Jumbo revealed. The half-track with infantry followed, its squad ready to dismount and clear buildings. Then disaster struck. A mine exploded under the half-track, killing several infantrymen and immobilising the vehicle. The tanks behind the half-track stopped, unwilling to risk mines themselves. Cobra King's driver kept going. Boggess looked back and realised only 2 other tanks had made it through Assenois with him. His relief column now consisted of 3 Shermans, 1 Jumbo and 2 standard models, heading toward Bastogne with no infantry support and no reinforcements immediately available. But turning back meant condemning the 101st to another night of siege. Boggess made the decision that would make him and his crew famous. They would push forward. The 3 tanks continued north from Assenois toward Bastogne, about a mile away. In the fading December light, moving through snow-covered fields and woods, they approached the American lines. This presented a new problem. The 101st, surrounded for a week, had been engaged in constant combat with German infiltrators. German troops had captured American vehicles and uniforms. Trust was in short supply. Boggess couldn't just roll up to American lines without risking being fired on by friendly forces. As Cobra King approached the outskirts of Bastogne, Boggess saw American troops taking cover in a dugout position. These were combat engineers from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, part of the 101st's defensive perimeter. The engineers initially took cover, unsure if the approaching tanks were American or captured vehicles being used by Germans. Boggess stopped Cobra King and climbed out of the turret, standing exposed on top of his tank. He shouted, asking if the engineers were American. One of the engineers, after a moment's hesitation, approached Cobra King. He stuck out his hand to Boggess and said the words that would end the siege of Bastogne. "Glad to see you." The time was 4:50 p.m. on December 26, 1944. Cobra King had become the first tank to break through to the surrounded 101st Airborne Division. Behind it, the rest of Patton's relief force would follow, reopening the road and ending the siege. Boggess and his crew had led the charge in a Jumbo whose armour had allowed them to crash through a defended village and keep moving when a lesser tank would have been knocked out. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, bolted from his underground headquarters to meet Patton's men. He shook hands with Boggess and the other tank commanders, thanking them for the relief. Within hours, supply trucks were rolling into Bastogne. The defence of Bastogne would continue for several more weeks, but the critical moment had passed. Patton's Third Army had arrived. For its actions during the relief of Bastogne, the 37th Tank Battalion received the Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest unit awards in the American military. Cobra King's crew returned to combat, with their tank bearing a new marking on the glacis plate. Someone had painted the words "First in Bastogne" in white chalk. Photographs of the marked tank appeared in newspapers across the United States. Cobra King became a symbol of American armoured determination. But for the crew, the war continued. Shortly after the relief of Bastogne, Cobra King received a modification common to many jumbos in early 1945. The 75mm M3 gun was removed and replaced with the high-velocity 76mm M1 gun. This upgrade, requested by commanders in the field, improved the jumbo's anti-tank capability while maintaining its superior armour protection. The 76mm gun, firing armour-piercing ammunition, could penetrate the frontal armour of a Panzer tank at combat ranges under ideal conditions. It gave jumbo crews a fighting chance against the heavier German tanks they might encounter. The conversion process was straightforward because the T-110 gun mount had been designed with the 76mm mount in mind. Damaged tanks would donate their 76mm guns and associated equipment. Armoured maintenance units would remove the 75mm gun and install the 76mm weapon, a process that could be completed in a few days. By March 1945, approximately 100 jumbos had been rearmed with 76mm guns. These upgunned jumbos represented the ultimate Sherman variant in terms of balanced firepower and protection. They could engage any German tank with reasonable chance of success, while maintaining frontal armour that was effectively immune to German 75mm guns. Cobra King, now mounting a 76mm gun, continued fighting through Germany in early 1945. Its luck ran out in late March during Operation Hammelburg, one of the most controversial missions of the war. General Patton, learning that his son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, was being held at a German POW camp near Hammelburg, ordered a raid to liberate the camp. The mission, led by Captain Abraham Baum, consisted of approximately 300 men and 57 vehicles, including tanks from the 37th Tank Battalion. The task force penetrated deep behind German lines, fighting through multiple defensive positions. They reached the POW camp and liberated the prisoners, but German forces, alerted to the American penetration, surrounded and destroyed the task force. On March 27, 1945, Cobra King was hit by a Panzerfaust rocket. The shaped charge warhead, one of the few German anti-tank weapons that could reliably penetrate a jumbo's armour at close range, struck the bow machine gun area. The explosion started a fire in the bow machine gun ammunition storage. The crew abandoned the burning tank, all surviving the engagement. They became prisoners of war, liberated 6 weeks later when American forces overran the area. The gutted hulk of Cobra King sat on the battlefield near Hammelburg for years after the war. Eventually recovered by American forces, the tank was used as a gate guard at various US military installations in Germany. Its historical significance forgotten, it sat exposed to weather for decades. In 2004, Army Chaplain Keith Good noticed the old Sherman tank sitting near the back gate of Rose Barracks in Vilseck, Germany. Something about it caught his attention. The hull looked thicker than a standard Sherman. The turret sat higher. After examining the tank more closely and doing some research, Good came to believe he had found Cobra King. He contacted Army historians who began investigating. Charles Lemons, curator at the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armour at Fort Knox, Kentucky, examined photographs and technical details. The turret casting bore unique mould numbers that matched documented photographs of Cobra King from 1944 and 1945. The hull serial numbers, once the corrosion was scraped away, matched records. In December 2008, exactly 64 years after Cobra King's famous relief of Bastogne, Army historians officially confirmed the tank's identity. The anonymous gateguard was indeed first in Bastogne. In July 2009, Cobra King was shipped back to the United States for restoration. The Patton Museum staff worked to restore the exterior to its December 1944 appearance, complete with the first in Bastogne marking. The interior, damaged beyond repair by decades of weather exposure, was stabilized but left unrestored. In 2017, Cobra King was moved to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, for display at the National Museum of the United States Army. When the museum opened to the public in 2020, Cobra King took its place of honor as one of the most significant tanks in American military history. But Cobra King was just one of 254 jumbos, and its story, while dramatic, represents the broader impact these tanks had on the final months of the war in Europe. Throughout late 1944 and early 1945, jumbos served in every American armoured division fighting in Europe. Their tactical employment evolved as commanders learned to maximise their strengths. The typical distribution saw each armoured division receiving between 12 and 15 jumbos. Rather than concentrating them in a single unit, commanders spread them throughout their tank battalions. Each company might receive 1 or 2 jumbos, ensuring that every unit had access to heavy armour when needed. This distribution pattern reflected lessons learned from German tank employment. The Germans had often concentrated their heavy armour in separate heavy tank battalions. This created powerful strike forces but meant that most German tank units lacked heavy armour support. The American approach, spreading jumbos throughout the force, ensured that every attack could benefit from heavy armour protection. The basic tactical employment pattern became standardised through experience. When advancing along roads, a jumbo would lead the column. Its armour could absorb the first shot from any ambush, protecting the more vulnerable tanks behind it. The jumbo's crew would then identify and suppress the threat, allowing the column to continue moving. When attacking prepared defences, jumbos would lead the assault force. They would close with enemy positions while other tanks provided overwatch and suppressing fire. The jumbo's armour allowed it to get close enough to use its 75mm or 76mm gun effectively against bunkers and fortifications. Regular Shermans would then exploit the breach the jumbo created. In urban combat, jumbos proved particularly valuable. City fighting exposed tanks to close-range threats from all directions. German infantry with Panzerfausts could hide in rubble and fire at extremely short ranges. The jumbo's all-around protection, while not as thick as the frontal armour, still exceeded standard Sherman protection. Combined with the frontal armour's virtual immunity, jumbos could lead urban assaults with reasonable confidence. The 1st Armoured Division, fighting in northern Italy, employed their jumbos in mountain warfare. The narrow mountain roads and limited manoeuvring room made the jumbo's armour particularly valuable. German defenders could easily cover the few available routes with anti-tank guns. A standard Sherman attempting to force such a position would likely be destroyed. A jumbo could push through under fire, accepting hits that would cripple lesser tanks. The 3rd Armoured Division, spearheading First Army's drive into Germany, used jumbos as their primary breakthrough tanks. When the division encountered major German defensive positions, they would mass their jumbos for the initial assault. Once the defences were breached, lighter tanks would exploit through the gap. The 7th Armoured Division employed an innovative tactic during the Rhine crossing operations. They positioned jumbos in hull-down defensive positions, using them as mobile pillboxes to cover engineering operations. German counterattacks ran into prepared positions with 6 inches of frontal turret armour. The jumbos could engage German armour at range while remaining effectively immune to return fire except from the heaviest German guns. But the jumbo wasn't invincible. German forces quickly learned that while the frontal armour was impregnable to most weapons, the sides, rear, and top remained vulnerable. Side armour, though thicker than standard Sherman armour at 76mm, could still be penetrated by German 75mm and 88mm guns at typical combat ranges. The rear armour was even thinner. German tactics evolved to focus on getting flank shots. Rather than engaging jumbos head-on, German tanks would attempt to manoeuvre for side shots. In open terrain, where movement was possible, this sometimes succeeded. Panzer IVs and Panthers would feint frontally, then attempt to swing around for a flank attack. Jumbo crews learned to keep their frontal armour pointed toward the greatest threat at all times. The 42-ton weight and slightly lower speed made rapid turning more difficult than in a standard Sherman. Crews had to anticipate threats and position their tanks accordingly. German infantry with Panzerfausts posed perhaps the greatest threat. The Panzerfaust 60, introduced in large numbers in late 1944, featured a shaped charge warhead that could penetrate over 200mm of armour. No amount of steel could reliably stop a Panzerfaust at close range. But the Panzerfaust had limitations. Its range was only about 60 metres, roughly 65 yards. German infantry had to get very close to use it effectively. This made supporting infantry critical for jumbo operations. American infantry, working closely with the tanks, would clear buildings and positions where Panzerfaust teams might hide. The combination of heavily armoured jumbos and alert infantry proved highly effective in reducing close-range anti-tank threats. Mines remained a constant danger. The jumbo's weight, 9 tons more than a standard Sherman, put additional stress on the suspension and tracks. Mine explosions that might damage a standard Sherman's track could break bogies or suspension components on a jumbo. Several jumbos were lost to mine damage that immobilized them in exposed positions where they could be engaged by German anti-tank guns until destroyed or abandoned. Artillery and air attack could also kill jumbos. While the armour protected against direct fire tank and anti-tank guns, overhead artillery bursts could damage the thinner top armour. The engine deck, with only minimal armour, was particularly vulnerable. German artillery observers learned to call fire on immobilised or stationary jumbos, attempting to achieve top-down hits that could penetrate. The most comprehensive test of jumbo armour came from captured examples. American intelligence teams wanted to understand exactly what German weapons could and couldn't penetrate jumbo armour. Tests conducted on captured German weapons firing at jumbo hull and turret sections revealed interesting results. The German 75 mm 40 L48 gun, standard armament on the Panzer IV and most Stooge assault guns, could not penetrate the jumbo's frontal glacis at any range using standard Panzergranate 39 ammunition. Test firings from point-blank range to 2,000 yards all failed to penetrate. The sloped 102mm armour with its high effective thickness proved immune. The turret front, presenting 152mm at a slight angle, also proved impenetrable to the 75 mm gun. The gun mantlet at 178mm absolutely could not be penetrated. The German 80 mm KWKC 36, mounted on the Tigerpanzer, could penetrate the jumbo's glacis at ranges under 500 yards using standard armour-piercing ammunition. Beyond 500 yards, penetration became uncertain, depending on exactly where the shell struck and the angle of impact. The turret front could be penetrated at ranges under 800 yards. The gun mantlet required essentially point-blank range for penetration. The German 75 mm K42 L70, the high-velocity gun mounted on the Panther tank, could penetrate the jumbo's glacis at ranges out to about 1,000 yards. The turret front could be penetrated at similar ranges. This made the Panther the most dangerous German tank threat to the jumbo, more so than the rarer Tiger I. The German 80 Intellium Cobra 43 L71, mounted on the Tiger II and used in several tank destroyer variants, could penetrate any part of the jumbo at combat ranges. But these guns were relatively rare on the Western Front in late 1944 and early 1945. The practical reality was that most German anti-tank weapons in 1944 and 1945 could not reliably penetrate a jumbo from the front. The standard Pak-40, the most numerous German anti-tank gun, was ineffective. The Panzer IV, the backbone of German armoured forces, couldn't penetrate frontally. Even the feared Tiger I had limited capability against jumbo frontal armour beyond medium ranges. This gave jumbo crews an enormous psychological advantage. They knew their armour could take punishment. They could afford to be aggressive, to close with the enemy, to take risks that would be suicidal in a standard Sherman. This confidence translated into tactical success. One jumbo commander, interviewed after the war, described the feeling of invincibility. You knew in your head that something could still kill you, a lucky shot to the side, a Panzerfaust at close range, an 88 from a Tiger, but when you're in combat and German anti-tank rounds are bouncing off your glacis, you feel unstoppable. We would charge positions that would have been suicide in a regular Sherman. The Germans would fire, see the round bounce, and fire again. By then we were on top of them. The production total of 254 tanks meant jumbos remained relatively rare throughout the war. At any given time, an American armoured division might have only 8 to 12 jumbos operational, out of an authorised strength of nearly 200 tanks. This scarcity meant that jumbo crews were expected to take on the most dangerous missions. Every attack seemed to call for jumbo participation. The strain on crews and machines was intense. Maintenance on jumbos required special attention. The additional weight stressed every component of the suspension and drivetrain. Tracks wore faster. Final drive failures occurred more frequently. The extended end connectors, the duckbills that spread the weight, would sometimes break off, requiring repair or replacement. But American logistics proved equal to the challenge. Spare parts, delivered from the United States and from forward supply depots, kept most jumbos operational most of the time. The maintenance readiness rate for jumbos remained roughly equivalent to standard Shermans, a testament to the robust design and excellent logistical support. As the war entered its final months in early 1945, the jumbo's role evolved. With Allied armies driving deep into Germany, resistance stiffened as German forces fought on their own soil. The jumbo's ability to lead assaults remained critical, but increasingly they were used in urban combat as German forces retreated into cities. The battle for Cologne in March 1945 saw extensive jumbo employment. The 3rd Armoured Division, fighting street by street through the damaged city, used jumbos to lead every major assault. German defenders, using the rubble as cover, could fire Panzerfausts from close range. The jumbo's armour, while not immune to Panzerfausts, gave crews better survival chances than standard Shermans. Several jumbos took multiple Panzerfaust hits and survived, their thick armour absorbing blows that would have penetrated standard armour. One particularly famous photograph from Cologne shows a knocked-out Panther tank in front of Cologne Cathedral. Less well known is that the Panther was destroyed by a jumbo from Task Force X of the 3rd Armoured Division. The jumbo, moving through a narrow street, encountered the Panther at a range of less than 100 yards. The German crew fired first, striking the jumbo's glacis. The shot bounced off. The jumbo's gunner, with a clear shot at the Panther's flank, fired. The 76 metal armour-piercing round penetrated the Panther's side armour and ignited ammunition. The Panther's crew bailed out as their tank burned. The engagement lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but it perfectly illustrated the jumbo's advantage. It could take a hit that would have killed a standard Sherman, then return fire from a protected position. During the crossing of the Rhine and the subsequent drive into central Germany, jumbos proved their worth repeatedly. German resistance, though weakening, remained fierce in many areas. Hitler's orders to fight to the last cartridge meant that German forces continued contesting every river, every town, every crossroads. The 2nd Armoured Division used jumbos extensively during the breakout from the Rhine bridgehead at Remagen. The division pushed nearly 100 miles in 3 days, a rapid advance made possible by aggressive use of armour. Jumbos led every column, their armour allowing them to push through hasty German defensive positions without stopping to reduce each one. If a jumbo encountered serious resistance, it would suppress the position with fire while calling for artillery or air support, but often, the mere presence of a heavily armoured tank rolling toward their position convinced German defenders to surrender or retreat. By April 1945, German forces were collapsing. Fuel shortages had immobilised most German armour, ammunition stocks were exhausted, new German tanks were being produced without fuel to operate them or crews trained to use them. But isolated pockets of resistance remained, particularly SS units that continued fighting fanatically. On April 11, 1945, elements of the 3rd Armoured Division liberated Buchenwald concentration camp. Among the tanks that first entered the camp was at least one jumbo. The crew, seeing the conditions in the camp and the emaciated prisoners, understood in a visceral way what they had been fighting for. The abstract mission of defeating Nazi Germany became concrete in the faces of the survivors they liberated. Similar scenes played out across Germany as American forces overran concentration camps, slave labour facilities, and POW camps. Jumbos, designed as assault tanks to break through fortified positions, found themselves serving as symbols of liberation. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Of the 254 jumbos produced, approximately 40 were total losses, destroyed beyond repair in combat. Another 50 or so were damaged but repairable. The majority survived the war intact, testament both to their armour protection and to the relatively short period they served in combat. Most jumbos saw only 6 to 8 months of combat operations. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the Army faced decisions about its tank fleet. Hundreds of Shermans of all variants sat in Europe, no longer needed. The M26 Pershing, the heavy tank that had arrived too late for extensive combat, was entering production in large numbers. The question arose, what to do with the jumbos? Some were retained for occupation duties, others were shipped to the Pacific, where planning for the invasion of Japan called for large numbers of heavily armoured assault tanks. The jumbo's armour would have been valuable in the anticipated fighting. But Japan's surrender in August 1945 ended that requirement. Most jumbos were eventually returned to the United States, or scrapped in Europe. By 1950, when the Korean War began, most surviving jumbos had been cut up for scrap. A few were retained at training facilities or used as range targets. The Army, focused on newer tanks like the M46 Patton and M47 Patton, had no use for upgraded Shermans. Today, approximately 10 M4A3E2 jumbos survive in museums and private collections around the world. Besides Cobra King at the National Museum of the United States Army, other examples include a jumbo at the French Tank Museum at Saumur, one at the Kubinka Tank Museum in Russia, and several in private collections. Each surviving jumbo represents a piece of engineering history, a solution to a specific tactical problem that arrived at exactly the right moment. The jumbo's combat record speaks for itself. In 6 months of combat, 254 tanks helped spearhead the Allied advance from France into Germany. They led columns, broke through defences, absorbed punishment that would have destroyed lesser tanks, and brought their crews home alive. The loss rate for jumbos, at roughly 16%, was significantly lower than the overall Sherman loss rate of approximately 25%. This difference, while partly due to superior armour, also reflected the jumbo's typical employment. Leading attacks exposed them to more fire, but their armour protection more than compensated. The tactical lessons learned from jumbo employment influenced post-war tank design. The American M26 Pershing, M46 Patton, and subsequent designs all emphasized heavy frontal armour. The idea of using sloped armour to increase effective thickness became standard practice. The jumbo proved that a tank could carry extremely heavy armour and remain mobile enough for offensive operations. The firepower debate sparked by the jumbo's initial armament with a 75mm gun continued for decades. American tankers in World War II generally preferred the 76mm gun for its superior armour penetration. But the 75mm gun was better. High explosive shell remained valuable for many targets. This debate eventually led to development of multi-purpose ammunition that combined good armour penetration with effective high explosive capability. The most important legacy of the jumbo might be psychological. American tankers, who had spent much of 1944 feeling undergunned and under-armoured compared to German tanks, finally had a tank that could take a punch. The confidence this instilled spread throughout American armoured units. Crews knew that if they got into serious trouble, a jumbo could come bail them out. German forces, conversely, lost confidence in their standard anti-tank weapons. When your 75mm gun, which had reliably killed Shermans for 2 years, suddenly stopped working against a new variant, doubt crept in. German after-action reports from late 1944 show increasing concern about American armour capabilities. The jumbo contributed to a broader German perception that American material superiority was overwhelming. Modern military historians have debated whether the jumbo program was worth the resources invested. Some argue that the 254 tanks produced had minimal impact on the war's outcome. Germany was already losing by September 1944 when jumbos arrived. The war would have been won without them. Others counter that the jumbo's tactical impact exceeded its small numbers. The ability to lead attacks with heavily armoured tanks saved American lives and accelerated the advance into Germany. Every day the war ended sooner meant fewer casualties on all sides. The production resources argument also deserves examination. Building 254 jumbos required steel, manufacturing capacity and shipping space that could have been used for other purposes. But the additional cost over standard Shermans was relatively modest. The extra armour added perhaps 15% to the cost and maybe 10% to the production time. The more significant resource cost came from the specialised turret castings, which required foundry capacity that could have produced other components. But given American industrial capacity in 1944, building jumbos didn't meaningfully reduce production of other equipment. The same factories that built jumbos also produced thousands of standard Shermans. The specialised components came from dedicated facilities that weren't being fully utilised for other programs. From a tactical perspective, the jumbo represented a successful response to a specific battlefield problem. American commanders needed heavily armoured assault tanks. The Army provided them in a time frame that would be considered impossible by modern standards. From concept to combat deployment in 6 months, demonstrated remarkable organisational agility. The rapid production and fielding also demonstrated the value of incremental upgrades to existing designs, rather than waiting for perfect new designs. The M26 Pershing, while superior to the Sherman in most respects, arrived too late to significantly impact the war. The Jumbo, built by modifying existing Shermans, arrived when it could make a difference. This lesson, that good enough now beats perfect later, influenced American military equipment development for decades. The technical achievement of the Jumbo shouldn't be understated. Creating a tank with frontal armour exceeding the Tiger I while maintaining reasonable mobility required sophisticated engineering. The use of sloped armour to maximise protection without excessive weight was ahead of its time. The turret, with 152mm of cast armour, pushed the limits of American foundry technology in 1944. The maintenance and operational aspects also deserve recognition. American tankers and maintenance crews had to learn to operate and maintain a significantly heavier tank with minimal additional training. The fact that Jumbos maintained operational readiness rates comparable to standard Shermans speaks to both the robust design and the skill of American maintenance personnel. The battlefield performance of Jumbo armour validated the design choices made under intense time pressure. The engineers at Fisher Tank Arsenal, working with incomplete information about German anti-tank capabilities and forced to make rapid decisions, got it right. The armour scheme they developed provided protection exactly where it was needed most. The psychological impact on both American and German forces represented an unintended but significant benefit. American morale improved when crews knew they had access to tanks that could survive hits from German weapons. German morale decreased as their standard anti-tank weapons proved ineffective. These psychological effects, while impossible to quantify precisely, contributed to battlefield outcomes. In the broader context of World War II armour development, the Jumbo represents a transitional design. It bridged the gap between the medium tanks of early war design and the heavy tanks that would dominate the early Cold War period. It demonstrated that heavy armour could be combined with reasonable mobility in a tactically useful platform. The specific tactical niche the Jumbo filled, the heavily armoured assault tank, would be incorporated into post-war American armour doctrine. Subsequent American tank designs all emphasised heavy frontal protection. The M103 heavy tank, developed in the 1950s, carried frontal armour up to 305mm thick. The M1 Abrams, entering service in 1980, featured composite armour that provided protection equivalent to over 600mm of steel. The Jumbo's influence can be seen in these designs' emphasis on survivability. The lessons learned from Jumbo employment also influenced infantry-tank cooperation tactics. The success of Jumbos in urban and close terrain depended on close cooperation with infantry. Post-war American combined arms doctrine emphasized this cooperation, with infantry and armour training together extensively. For the German forces that faced Jumbos, the experience reinforced their growing sense of material inferiority. By late 1944, German troops were accustomed to facing American forces that enjoyed advantages in air power, artillery and logistics. The arrival of heavily armoured tanks that their standard weapons couldn't penetrate added to their sense of hopelessness. German veterans interviewed after the war often cited American material superiority as the decisive factor in their defeat. The Jumbo, while a small part of that superiority, symbolised the broader trend. The human story of the Jumbo involves the crews who operated them and the commanders who employed them. These men, mostly in their late teens and early 20s, found themselves commanding the most heavily armoured American tanks in Europe. They carried the responsibility of leading attacks and protecting their fellow tankers. The stress of this responsibility, combined with the intensity of combat in the war's final months, took its toll. Post-traumatic stress, though not yet recognised or treated effectively, affected many Jumbo crews. They had survived situations that should have killed them, watched friends die in other tanks, and participated in some of the war's most intense fighting. For the tankers in standard Shermans, the Jumbo represented both reassurance and envy. Reassurance because they knew heavily armoured tanks could lead attacks and draw fire away from more vulnerable machines. Envy because everyone wanted to be in the tank with 6 inches of frontal armour rather than the one with 3 inches. This created some tension in tank units, with Jumbo crews seen as having an easier, safer job. The reality was more complex. Jumbo crews faced additional expectations and were assigned the most dangerous missions. The armour provided better protection but didn't guarantee survival. Several Jumbo crews were killed when their tanks were knocked out by weapons that could penetrate even the heavy armour. The commanders who employed Jumbos had to balance competing demands. They needed the heavy armour for assaults and column leading, but they couldn't afford to concentrate all their jumbos in one place. The distribution pattern that emerged, spreading jumbos throughout tank battalions, represented a compromise between competing tactical requirements. Some commanders wanted to mass jumbos for breakthrough operations, others wanted them distributed for maximum availability. The Army's policy of spreading them relatively evenly proved effective. The maintenance personnel who kept jumbos running deserve recognition. These men, working in field conditions often under fire, dealt with equipment pushed to its limits. The additional weight of the jumbo stressed components beyond their design specifications. Tracks wore out faster, final drives failed more frequently, transmissions overheated. The mechanics learned to work around these problems, keeping tanks operational through ingenuity and hard work. The supply system that provided parts and ammunition for jumbos demonstrated American logistical superiority. Every jumbo required specialized parts, particularly the extended end connectors and reinforced suspension components. These had to be shipped from the United States to Europe, then distributed to frontline units. The system worked well enough that jumbos maintained operational readiness despite their unique requirements. In the final analysis, the M4A3E2 Sherman Jumbo succeeded in its mission. It provided American armored forces with a heavily protected assault tank that could lead attacks and survive hits from standard German anti-tank weapons. It entered combat at a critical moment and made a measurable difference in the war's final months. The number produced, 254 tanks, was small compared to the over 40,000 Shermans of all types produced during the war. But those 254 tanks had an impact disproportionate to their numbers. Every column led by a jumbo benefited from its armour. Every attack spearheaded by jumbos succeeded with fewer casualties. Every German gun crew that watched their rounds bounce off jumbo armour lost confidence in their weapons. The jumbo didn't win the war. No single weapon system wins a war. But it contributed to victory in meaningful ways. It saved American lives. It accelerated the advance into Germany. It demonstrated that American industry could respond rapidly to battlefield requirements. And it showed that the Sherman, often criticized as inferior to German tanks, could be modified into a platform that German gunners feared. The legacy of Cobra King and its 253 sister tanks lives on in the few surviving examples and in the memories of the men who served in them. These 42-ton monsters, rushed into production in response to battlefield needs, proved that sometimes the right weapon at the right time matters more than the perfect weapon that arrives too late. When German anti-tank gun crews watched their 75mm rounds bounce harmlessly off that thick American armour, they learned a lesson that their high command had ignored. Industrial capacity matters, and in 1944, America's industrial capacity was producing tanks that could laugh at German guns.